Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall, she was at the shooting range with her father, a retired Marine who taught her that precision and discipline were more valuable than popularity. By age 16, she could outshoot most adults in the county, but her real dream lay far beyond the dusty ranges of her hometown. The Navy recruiter's office in downtown San Antonio buzzed with activity on that humid Tuesday morning in 2019. Young men filled out paperwork, their faces determined and eager. Sarah walked in wearing her father's old Marine t-shirt and jeans, her long black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. The recruiter, Chief Petty Officer Williams, barely glanced up from his computer screen. "Can I help you, miss? Are you here for your boyfriend?" he asked without looking at her directly. "I'm here for myself," Sarah replied firmly. "I want information about becoming a Navy SEAL." The room went quiet. Every head turned toward her, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. Chief Williams finally looked up, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to complete disbelief. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, leaning back in his chair. "SEAL training isn't for girls. It's the most physically demanding military training in the world. These programs are designed for men who can carry 200-pound teammates on their backs through freezing water. Maybe you'd be interested in becoming a Navy nurse or working in communications?" Sarah's jaw tightened. She had expected this response, but hearing it still stung. "I can handle whatever training you throw at me," she said quietly. The chief chuckled, and a few of the young men in the office joined in. "Look, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let me save you some time. Women aren't allowed in SEAL training. It's not about being mean or unfair. It's about biology and the reality of combat situations." What Chief Williams didn't know was that Sarah had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Her father had trained her not just in marksmanship, but in every aspect of military fitness. She could run 10 miles without breaking a sweat, complete more pull-ups than most college athletes, and had spent summers working construction jobs to build the kind of functional strength that books couldn't teach. "Just give me the physical fitness requirements," Sarah insisted. "Let me show you what I can do." The chief sighed and pulled out a standard information packet. "Fine, but you're wasting both our time. The Navy doesn't make exceptions, especially not for SEAL teams." As Sarah walked out of that office with the packet clutched in her hands, she could hear the whispered conversations behind her. Some were mocking, others were curious, but all of them underestimated the fire that burned inside this quiet young woman from Texas. That evening, Sarah spread the requirements across her bedroom floor like battle plans. The physical standards were brutal. A 500-yard swim in under 12 minutes and 30 seconds, at least 50 push-ups in 2 minutes, 50 sit-ups in 2 minutes, 10 pull-ups with no time limit, and a 1.5-mile run in boots and pants in under 10 minutes and 30 seconds. These were just the minimum standards to be considered. Her father found her there hours later, still studying the documents with the intensity of a scholar preparing for the most important exam of her life. "Mija," he said softly, using the Spanish pet name he'd called her since childhood. "Are you sure about this? The military can be a hard place for women, especially in combat roles." Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held the same determination he'd seen in his own reflection decades earlier. "Dad, you always told me that excellence silences doubt. If I can meet their standards, exceed them, prove I belong there, they'll have to take me seriously." Her father nodded slowly. He knew that look. It was the same expression she'd worn at age 8 when she'd insisted on learning to shoot, at 12 when she'd demanded to train with the high school wrestling team, and at 15 when she'd convinced the local police department to let her join their tactical training exercises. "Then we better get to work," he said simply. The next morning, Sarah's real training began, not the casual weekend shooting sessions or the after-school runs she'd been doing for years, but a systematic military-style preparation that would either forge her into the warrior she believed she could become or break her in the attempt. She had no way of knowing that her journey would ultimately change not just her own life, but the very policies that had seemed impossible to overcome. All she knew was that somewhere in the depths of her heart, She carried an unshakable belief that she belonged among America's elite warriors, and no amount of skepticism from others would convince her otherwise. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., but Sarah was already awake, staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom. 6 months had passed since her visit to the recruiter's office, and her body had transformed into something she barely recognized. Her father's training regimen had been merciless, designed not just to meet the Navy's standards but to absolutely demolish them. Every morning began the same way, a brutal swim in the local lake regardless of weather, followed by calisthenics. That left her muscles screaming. Her father had converted their garage into a makeshift training facility, complete with pull-up bars, weighted vests, and obstacle course elements. Neighbors had grown accustomed to seeing Sarah running through their streets at dawn, carrying sandbags or dragging tire chains behind her. The physical transformation was obvious, but the mental change was even more profound. Sarah had developed the kind of focused intensity that made people step aside when she walked into a room. Her high school classmates no longer saw the quiet girl who used to sit in the back of English class. They saw someone who had found her purpose and was willing to sacrifice everything to achieve it. On this particular morning, Sarah's father had planned something different. Instead of their usual training routine, he drove her to Camp Bullseyes, a military training facility outside San Antonio where he still had connections from his Marine days. "Today you meet someone special," he told her as they parked outside a nondescript building. "Master Chief Rodriguez retired from the SEALs 3 years ago. He owes me a favor from way back, and he's agreed to evaluate your progress." Master Chief. Rodriguez was exactly what Sarah expected a former SEAL to look like: compact, weathered, with eyes that seemed to see everything and give away nothing. He studied her with the same intensity she might use to examine a rifle before a competition. "So you're the girl who wants to be a SEAL," he said without preamble. "Your father says you're serious about this, but I've heard that before. Lots of people think they want to be special operators until they understand what it really means." For the next 4 hours, Master Chief Rodriguez put Sarah through a condensed version of SEAL screening tests that most grown men failed. She swam until her lungs burned, completed obstacle courses that tested every muscle in her body, and endured psychological pressure designed to break down mental barriers. The final test was marksmanship. Rodriguez led her to a shooting range, where targets were set up at various distances and angles. The conditions were deliberately challenging: wind, moving targets, time pressure, and the fatigue from hours of physical exertion. "Show me what you can do," he said simply, handing her an M4 carbine. This was Sarah's element. All the years of training with her father, all the competitions she'd won, all the hours spent perfecting her technique, culminated in this moment. She controlled her breathing, found her natural point of aim, and began engaging targets with mechanical precision. The first shot rang out, and a distant target disappeared. Then another, and another. Rodriguez watched through binoculars, his expression never changing. But Sarah could sense his growing attention. She shifted positions, engaged targets at different ranges, adapted to wind changes, and maintained the same deadly accuracy that had made her legendary in local shooting circles. When the smoke cleared, Sarah had achieved something that Rodriguez had rarely seen even among experienced military personnel. Every target had been neutralized with single, precise shots. No wasted ammunition, no hesitation, no mistakes. Rodriguez lowered his binoculars and studied Sarah with new respect. "That was impressive," he admitted. "But marksmanship is just one small part of what SEALs do. You'll face people who will try to break you physically and mentally. You'll be pushed beyond what you think is possible, and most people quit." "I won't quit," Sarah said quietly. "Everyone says that. But when you're hypothermic in freezing water at 2 a.m., when instructors are screaming in your face, when your body is telling you to give up, what makes you think you'll be different?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked directly into Rodriguez's eyes. "Because I've been preparing for this my entire life. Not just physically, but mentally. I know who I am, and why I'm doing this. When things get difficult, I won't be questioning my decision. I'll be proving it was right." Rodriguez nodded slowly. Something in her tone convinced him that this wasn't teenage bravado. This was the kind of quiet confidence that he'd seen in the best operators he'd ever worked with. "There's something you need to know," he said finally. "The official policy hasn't changed. Women still aren't allowed in SEAL training. But policies do change, and when they do, you need to be ready. What I saw today tells me you have potential, but potential means nothing without opportunity." As they drove home that evening, Sarah's father was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. "Rodriguez told me something before we left. He said you have the best natural shooting ability he's ever evaluated. That's high praise from a man who's trained with the best in the world." Sarah stared out the window at the Texas landscape rushing by. She felt closer to her dream than ever before, but also more aware of the obstacles ahead. The physical training had been the easy part. Now came the real challenge, finding a way to convince the United States Navy that their policies needed to change. 2 years later, Sarah stood in a different Navy recruiting office, this time in Virginia Beach, just miles from the legendary Naval Special Warfare Center where SEALs trained. The policy hadn't changed, but Sarah had. She was no longer the hopeful teenager from Texas. She was now a decorated Navy petty officer with an impeccable service record and skills that had earned her recognition throughout the fleet. Her journey to this moment had been strategic and deliberate. After graduating high school, Sarah had enlisted in the Navy and specifically requested assignment to jobs that would demonstrate her capabilities. She'd served as a naval intelligence specialist, where her analytical skills impressed senior officers. She'd completed advanced combat training courses, excelling in every program they allowed her to enter. Most importantly, she'd built a network of advocates who had witnessed her exceptional abilities firsthand. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes, the recruiting officer, was different from Chief Williams back in Texas. She was a Naval Academy graduate who had fought her own battles to advance in a male-dominated service. When Sarah entered her office, Hayes immediately recognized the quiet confidence of a serious warrior. "Petty Officer Martinez," Hayes said, reviewing Sarah's file. "Your record is remarkable. Top scores in intelligence training, expert marksman, qualification with multiple weapon systems, leadership positions in every unit you've served. Your commanding officer's evaluations are glowing, but I know why you're here, and I have to give you the same answer that's been given to every woman who's asked." Sarah remained at attention. "Ma'am, I understand the current policy, but I also understand that policies evolve when circumstances demonstrate they should. I'm here to formally request consideration for SEAL training and to present evidence that I can meet or exceed every standard required." Hayes gestured for Sarah to sit. "I've been watching your career, Petty Officer. Word gets around when someone exceptional is making waves. Your instructors at various schools have been talking about you for months, but the physical standards for SEAL training aren't just requirements. They're predictions of who can survive the most demanding military training in the world." "I understand that, ma'am. That's why I'd like to demonstrate my capabilities, rather than just discuss them." Hayes studied Sarah carefully. There was something different about this request. Most people who wanted to join elite military units were driven by ego or the desire for recognition. Sarah projected something else entirely. The calm certainty of someone who had already proven to herself that she belonged. "The obstacle course," Hayes said finally. "There's a modified version of the SEAL training obstacle course here on base. It's used for fitness assessments and training demonstrations. If you could complete it in exceptional time, it might help your case when policy reviews come up." Sarah's pulse quickened, but her expression remained steady. "I would welcome that opportunity, ma'am." 3 days later, a small group gathered at the obstacle course facility. Word had spread through the base about the impossible demonstration attempt. Some spectators came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism, and a few came because they genuinely hoped to witness something historic. The course was brutal, a series of walls, rope climbs, crawls, and barriers designed to test every aspect of physical fitness and mental toughness. The existing record for Navy personnel was held by a SEAL instructor who had completed it in just under 8 minutes. Most people took 12 minutes or more, and many couldn't finish at all. Sarah approached the starting line wearing standard Navy physical training gear, She had trained on similar obstacles for years, but never with this level of scrutiny. Television cameras were present. Hayes had arranged for documentation, understanding that if Sarah succeeded, this footage might be important for future policy discussions. "You don't have to prove anything to anybody," her father whispered, as he stood nearby. He had driven from Texas to witness this moment. "You've already proven everything to yourself." Sarah nodded and stepped up to the line. The course stretched before her like a physical manifestation of every barrier she'd faced throughout her journey. Each obstacle represented another person who had told her she couldn't, another policy that said she didn't belong, another assumption about what women could achieve. The starting whistle blew, and Sarah exploded forward. She attacked the first wall with controlled aggression, using technique rather than just strength to propel herself up and over. The rope climb was smooth and efficient, her grip sure despite the sweat beginning to coat her hands. She navigated the crawling sections with speed that surprised even her supporters. Halfway through the course, Sarah was ahead of pace for the existing record. The crowd had grown quiet, recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. But the most challenging obstacles lay ahead, a series of barriers that required not just physical ability, but the kind of mental toughness that separated elite operators from everyone else. Sarah approached each remaining obstacle with the same methodical precision she brought to marksmanship. She visualized her movements, executed them flawlessly, and moved to the next challenge without hesitation. Her breathing remained controlled, her movements efficient, her focus absolute. As she approached the final obstacle, a 30-foot rope climb followed by a sprint to the finish line, Sarah could hear scattered cheers from the crowd. But she blocked out everything except the task at hand. The rope burned her hands as she climbed with smooth, powerful pulls. At the top, she rang the bell and rappelled down with controlled speed. The final sprint felt like it lasted forever and ended in an instant. Sarah crossed the finish line and immediately looked at the timer. 6 minutes and 47 seconds. She had shattered the existing record by more than a minute. The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah barely heard it. She was focused on Lieutenant Commander Hayes, who was staring at the timer with an expression of amazement and concern. Sarah had just made it impossible for anyone to claim she couldn't handle the physical demands of SEAL training. Hayes approached her as Sarah cooled down from the run. "That was the most impressive athletic performance I've ever witnessed on this course," she said quietly. "But you understand what this means, don't you? You've just made yourself impossible to ignore." The video of Sarah's record-breaking obstacle course run spread through military social media like wildfire. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times, shared by active duty personnel, veterans, and civilians alike. The comment section became a battlefield of opinions about women in combat, military standards, and what Sarah's performance meant for the future of special operations. Admiral Rebecca Morrison, the highest-ranking woman in Naval Special Warfare Command, requested a meeting with Sarah within a week of the demonstration. The admiral had spent her career navigating the complex politics of military advancement as a woman, and she understood the significance of what Sarah had accomplished. They met in Admiral Morrison's office at Naval Special Warfare Command Headquarters, a building that housed some of the most elite military units in the world. Sarah had never been in such proximity to the SEAL training facilities, and she could feel the weight of history and tradition surrounding her. "Petty Officer Martinez," Admiral Morrison began, "your performance has created what we might call a productive problem. You've demonstrated capabilities that make it difficult for anyone to argue that physical standards are the barrier to women in SEAL training." Sarah remained at attention. "Thank you, ma'am. I hope my performance demonstrates that individual merit should be the determining factor for training opportunities." The Admiral gestured for Sarah to sit. "The reality is more complicated than that. Physical ability is just one aspect of what we evaluate. There are concerns about unit cohesion, logistical challenges, and frankly, political considerations that go far beyond what any individual can control. I understand those challenges, ma'am, but I also believe that excellence has a way of solving problems that seem impossible on paper." Admiral Morrison smiled slightly. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. I have a proposition for you, but it comes with significant risks to your career and no guarantee of success. She explained that the Navy was under increasing pressure from Congress to evaluate its policies regarding women in combat roles. Sarah's demonstration had provided ammunition for legislators who wanted to see barriers removed, but it had also intensified opposition from those who believed traditional policies should remain unchanged. We're going to conduct an unofficial evaluation, Admiral Morrison continued. You would participate in selected portions of SEAL training alongside regular candidates, but not as an official trainee. It would be presented as a research study on physical standards and training methodologies. Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. What would that involve, ma'am? Everything except the official graduation and designation. You'd go through the same physical training, the same mental challenges, the same evaluations as everyone else. If you succeed, it provides evidence for policy change. If you fail, it reinforces current restrictions and probably ends your military career. The risks were enormous. Sarah would be under intense scrutiny from instructors who might be biased against her presence, fellow trainees who might resent her participation, and media attention that would amplify every success or failure. Most dangerously, she would have no official protection if the evaluation was deemed unsuccessful. How long do I have to decide? Sarah asked. 24 hours. The next training class begins in 2 weeks, and if you're going to participate, we need time to prepare the administrative framework. Sarah left the meeting with her mind spinning. She called her father from her car in the parking lot, sitting in the shadow of buildings where America's most elite warriors trained. Mija, this is what you've worked toward your entire life, her father said after she explained the situation. But I need to ask you something. Are you doing this to prove something to other people, or because you genuinely believe you belong there? It was the question Sarah had been asking herself for years. Both, she answered honestly. I want to prove that women can excel in any role they're given the opportunity to pursue. But more than that, I believe I can contribute something valuable to these teams. I've never wanted anything more in my life. Then you have your answer. You didn't come this far to only come this far. That evening, Sarah went for a long run on the beach near her base quarters. As waves crashed beside her and the sun set over the Atlantic, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Every mile she'd run, every weight she'd lifted, every target she'd hit had been preparing her for this opportunity. She thought about Master Chief Rodriguez, who had told her months earlier that potential meant nothing without opportunity. She thought about Lieutenant Commander Hayes, who had risked her own reputation by allowing Sarah to attempt the obstacle course demonstration. She thought about Admiral Morrison, who was putting her career on the line to create a pathway that might benefit women for generations to come. Most of all, she thought about the girl she'd been in that recruiting office in Texas, so determined and so naive about the obstacles ahead. That girl had believed excellence would be enough. The woman she'd become understood that excellence was just the entry fee for the real battle. Sarah stopped running and stood facing the ocean. Somewhere beyond the horizon was everything she'd ever dreamed of achieving. Between her and those dreams lay the most challenging military training in the world, designed to break people who thought they were unbreakable. She pulled out her phone and composed a text message to Admiral Morrison. Ma'am, I accept the evaluation opportunity. I'll be ready. As she hit send, Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the same calm focus that came over her when she was about to take a difficult shot. Everything in her life had led to this moment, and she was finally ready to discover what she was truly made of. The first day of basic underwater demolition SEAL training arrived with the kind of gray, cold morning that seemed designed to crush spirits before they could fully form. Sarah stood in formation with 37 male candidates, all of whom had trained for years to reach this starting line. The instructors, weathered veterans with reputations for breaking strong men, studied the group with the calculating gaze of predators evaluating prey. Instructor Chief Petty Officer Michael Torres had been personally briefed about Sarah's participation in the evaluation program. He was a 15-year SEAL veteran who had served in combat zones around the world, and he understood the political implications of her presence. But he also understood something more important. His job was to identify warriors, regardless of gender, and eliminate everyone who didn't measure up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the beach, "I don't care why you think you're here. I don't care about your high school wrestling championships, your college athletics, or your impressive military records. None of that matters now. What matters is whether you can perform when everything inside you is screaming to quit." The first week was designed to establish baseline fitness and introduce candidates to the relentless pace of SEAL training. Sarah had prepared extensively, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the systematic destruction of comfort zones that defined every moment of the program. The physical training was brutal, but manageable for someone of Sarah's conditioning. What proved more challenging was the psychological warfare. Instructors deliberately targeted her with additional scrutiny, harder questions, and impossible standards that seemed designed to provoke an emotional response. "Martinez," Chief Torres would shout during particularly difficult exercises, "you're slowing down the entire class. Is this where you realize you don't belong?" Sarah learned to respond with the same steady professionalism she brought to everything else. "Hooyah, Instructor Torres, I'll do better." But the real test came from her fellow candidates. Some were supportive, impressed by her abilities and determination. Others were openly resentful of what they perceived as special treatment or political correctness run amok. A few were waiting for her to fail so they could point to her performance as evidence that women didn't belong in elite military units. The turning point came during the third week, in a training evolution called drown-proofing. Candidates had their hands tied behind their backs and feet bound together, then were required to survive in a swimming pool for 20 minutes. It was designed to simulate survival situations and test mental composure under extreme stress. Sarah watched as two candidates before her failed to complete the exercise, panicking when water entered their lungs and having to be pulled from the pool by instructors. When her turn came, she approached the pool edge with the same methodical calm she brought to marksmanship competitions. "You sure about this, Martinez?" one of the other candidates whispered. "Nobody's going to think less of you if you sit this one out." Sarah looked at him with eyes that had grown harder over the past 3 weeks. "I didn't come here to sit anything out." She entered the water and immediately felt the disorientation of having her primary survival tools, her hands and feet, rendered useless. The key was mental control, managing panic before it could take hold, and maintaining awareness of body position and breathing despite the artificial helplessness. For 20 minutes, Sarah floated, dove to retrieve objects from the pool bottom, using only her teeth, and performed each required task while bound. She focused on her breathing, visualized herself succeeding, and refused to acknowledge the voice in her head that whispered about drowning. When she emerged from the pool, several candidates applauded spontaneously. More importantly, she noticed Chief Torres nodding slightly, the first sign of approval she'd seen from him since training began. The respect she earned that day changed the dynamic within her training class. Candidates who had been skeptical began including her in study groups and informal training sessions. The hazing became less personal and more about shared suffering that bonds military units together. But Sarah's greatest challenge was still ahead: marksmanship evaluation under combat stress. This was supposed to be her strongest skill, the area where she could demonstrate clear superiority. The course of fire was designed to simulate real combat conditions, with multiple targets at varying distances, time pressure, physical exhaustion, and psychological stress designed to degrade performance. Sarah approached the firing line after completing a brutal obstacle course that had left most candidates shaking with fatigue. Her hands were unsteady, her breathing was elevated, and her vision was slightly blurred from exhaustion. These were exactly the conditions where her years of training would either prove their value or reveal their limitations. The first target appeared at 300 yards, a difficult shot under any circumstances, nearly impossible given her current physical state. Sarah controlled her breathing, found her natural point of aim, and took the shot. Hit. The second target was closer but moving. Sarah tracked it smoothly and fired when the movement pattern brought it into her optimal engagement window. Hit. Target. After target appeared, each presenting unique challenges. Some were partially concealed, Others appeared for only seconds. Several required precise shots to avoid hitting civilian targets placed nearby. Sarah engaged each one with mechanical precision, her muscle memory taking over when conscious. Thought became impossible due to fatigue. When the exercise ended, Sarah had achieved something that instructors had rarely seen. 15 consecutive hits under maximum stress conditions. Not 14. Not 16 with one miss. 15 perfect shots when most experienced military personnel would have been fortunate to hit half their targets. Chief Torres approached her as she cleared her weapon. "Martinez, that was the finest display of combat marksmanship I've witnessed in 20 years of training SEALs. You just shot better under stress than most people shoot on a perfect day at a comfortable range." For the first time since training began, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you, Instructor Torres. I've been preparing for this opportunity my entire life." "I can tell," he replied. "And I think it's time we stopped treating this like an experiment and started treating it like what it is. A warrior proving she belongs among warriors." 6 months later, Sarah stood on the same beach where her journey had begun, but everything had changed. Of the 38 candidates who had started the program, only 12 remained. Sarah was not only among them, she had finished in the top 3 overall, excelling in every phase of training from underwater demolitions to advanced combat tactics. The evaluation program had become something much larger than anyone had anticipated. Media attention had been constant but respectful, focusing on Sarah's performance rather than sensationalizing her gender. More importantly, her success had forced military leadership to confront the gap between their assumptions and the evidence before their eyes. Admiral Morrison stood before the graduating class, addressing not just the successful candidates but a crowd that included senior military officials, members of Congress, and representatives from allied nations who were watching America's approach to military integration. "Today we graduate 12 new naval special warfare operators," she announced. "Each of these individuals has demonstrated the physical capabilities, mental toughness, and character required to serve among our nation's most elite military units. They have earned their place through merit, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to excellence." Sarah listened to these words with emotions she had kept carefully controlled throughout the entire training process. She thought about the girl from Texas who had walked into that recruiting office years earlier, so certain that excellence would be enough to overcome any obstacle. That girl had been right, but she had underestimated how much excellence would be required. When Admiral Morrison called her name, Sarah stepped forward to receive her SEAL trident, the symbol she had dreamed about since childhood. But she also understood that this moment represented more than personal achievement. She was receiving this recognition not just as Sarah Martinez, but as the woman who had proven that gender was irrelevant when measuring warrior potential. Chief Torres, who had become her strongest advocate during training, approached her after the ceremony. "Martinez, I owe you an apology. When this program started, I thought I was participating in a political exercise that would prove women couldn't handle SEAL training. Instead, you taught me that my assumptions were limiting my ability to recognize talent. No apology necessary, Chief. You treated me exactly like everyone else, which was all I ever wanted." "That's not entirely true," he admitted. "For the first few weeks, I held you to a higher standard, hoping you would quit so we could move past this experiment. But you never gave me a reason to do anything except respect your abilities." Sarah nodded. "I knew that was happening. But I also knew that earning your respect would mean more than receiving your sympathy." The conversation was interrupted by Admiral Morrison, who approached with a serious expression. "Sarah, we need to discuss your next assignment. Your success here has created opportunities, but also challenges that we need to address carefully." They moved to a quieter area, where Admiral Morrison explained the situation. Sarah's graduation had accelerated policy discussions that had been moving slowly through military bureaucracy. Several allied nations were requesting her participation in joint training exercises, wanting to evaluate their own integration policies. More immediately, she was being considered for assignment to active SEAL teams, which would make her the first woman to serve in that capacity. "The spotlight on you will be intense," Admiral Morrison warned. "Every mission, every decision, every success or failure will be scrutinized. You'll be representing not just yourself, but the principle that military service should be based on merit rather than gender. Sarah had expected this conversation. Ma'am, I understand the responsibilities that come with being first at anything, but I didn't go through this training to make political statements. I did it because I believe I can contribute to these teams and serve my country effectively. That's exactly why you succeeded where others might have failed. Your focus was always on performance rather than recognition. 3 months later, Sarah found herself in a briefing room preparing for her first operational deployment. She was assigned to SEAL Team 6, the most elite unit within Naval Special Warfare, for a counter-terrorism mission in Southeast Asia. Her teammates were veterans with years of combat experience, and they had initially been skeptical about integrating a rookie regardless of gender. But Sarah's training performance had preceded her, and her teammates were professional enough to judge her based on capabilities rather than preconceptions. During pre-deployment training, she had demonstrated that her marksmanship skills were not just exceptional under stress, but consistently superior to anyone else on the team. Lieutenant Commander Jake Stevens, the team leader, addressed Sarah privately before their departure. Martinez, I want you to know that you're here because you earned it, not because someone decided we needed to check a diversity box. But I also need you to understand that in combat, there's no room for proving points or making history. There's only mission success and bringing everyone home. Understood, sir. I'm not here to make history. I'm here to be the best teammate I can be. Good. Because based on what I've seen, you might be the best sniper this team has ever had. As their aircraft lifted off for deployment, Sarah looked out the window at the American coastline disappearing below. She thought about her father, who had taught her that excellence silences doubt. She thought about Master Chief Rodriguez, who had told her that potential meant nothing without opportunity. She thought about Admiral Morrison, who had risked her career to create that opportunity. Most of all, she thought about the young women who would follow after her, who would face fewer barriers because she had been willing to break through the ones in her path. They would still have to prove themselves through merit and dedication, but they would not have to prove that women could succeed in roles previously considered impossible. Sarah Martinez had not just earned her place among America's elite warriors. She had expanded the definition of what those warriors could look like. Her 15 consecutive bullseyes under impossible stress had been more than remarkable marksmanship. They had been shots that changed military history and opened doors that had been closed for generations. The quiet girl from Texas, hey,